Sometimes I forget that these videos are out there. Sometimes I forget that these videos are out there in perpetuity. Or, as they say, forever. Forever. We're getting ready. It's Saturday morning here at 10:49 in the AM East Coast time, 10:49 East Coast time, and we're getting ready to record. Oh, just saw 1 year ago my little son on Facebook picture, a little cutie. 10:50 Eastern time, 10:50 AM Eastern time. Here we are, Saturday, August 18th, and we're getting ready to record live this week's edition of What I Learned. What I Learned encapsulate the week's learning, the high points, the in-betweens, the curious. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't. I tell you what, let's talk a little thing about boredom. Been thinking a lot about boredom lately. I can't be bored, right? In life, I just don't want to be bored. I want to be excited. I want to be enthused. I want to be energetic. I want to have fun. I want to make a difference. All of these things. And that's why I do the things I do. Because the worst thing in the world is to be bored. And let me tell you, having books like these books on my desk, and having this right in front of me, of which I'm going to talk about my learnings for the week, that helped me from getting bored. That helps me from staying bored. And it ain't perfect. It ain't like you're just going to live it's not like you're just going to live in like a time of dessert, right? We all like dessert, right? But dessert ends. Or maybe you get a little too much of your dessert. Maybe you don't want another bite of ice cream. Maybe you don't want that extra bite of the blizzard that I'm going to get today or this weekend from Dairy Queen that has the peanut butter cups and the Reese's Pieces. Maybe you don't want one more bite of it. So it's not like you can just live in this state of dessert in perpetuity. There's our word again, in perpetuity. No, but what you can do is you can try to get close to that. You can try to create it. You can create it such that you get close to that. And that, my friends, is what we're going to do. That, my friends, is where it's at. So if you're watching, thanks for tuning in. I hope you're having ooh, is that a ghost? Ooh, is that a ghost? Or is it my shadow? Hope you're enjoying the weekend. It's Saturday morning. The weekend's just getting started. End of the summer, but generally there's some fun things at the end of the summer. The arts fests or the craft fairs, I feel like they're starting here in the next couple weeks, maybe. Corn on the Cob might be going out of its peak season. That's always fun, but I just had some delicious corn on the cob last night. Got a good workout in this morning. Got some good reading in this morning. Going to carry through another week with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I'm going to talk a lot about it here in this week's edition of What I Learned. And, excited to start a new book. It's upstairs. Excited to start a new book on AMX Kids. Oh, this is just so great. I'm just so excited. I really am. Some cool things going on. All right. I want to enjoy my weekend. So let's get started. Let's get this work out the way. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of What I Learned this week. I done gone lost my mind. I haven't really, but if you're watching on Facebook Live, you might be thinking to yourself, has this guy lost his mind? The truth is, no, I haven't lost my mind, but when I get in front of this camera, when I get in front of this microphone, I get really happy. And I was telling the Facebook Livers prior to hitting record that I don't like being bored. Right? Reading Ben and Jerry's book, The Inside Scoop, a great book. I covered it on the show. I interviewed Fred Chico Lager, who wrote the book, who was the original CEO of Ben and Jerry's. And I believe it was Ben of Ben and Jerry's. His mindset was, if it's not fun, why do it? And there's certainly a balance that you got to reach there. Or there's some realities that are put into that equation. But at the end of the day, I just don't want to be bored. I want to have fun. I want to be excited. I want to wake up enthused and energetic and probably a little bit nervous for each day. And that's really what drives the decisions I do. And it's really fun because Dredd and I have these conversations every day that it's like we're totally absorbing these conversations of these ideas and possibilities and directions, and this happens, or what are we going to do about this, or that happened, that didn't happen, we thought it was going to happen. All of these variables, and we just bop, bop. We're like a pinball machine, but we just don't stop. It's like bop, 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 but we just won't stop and we don't stop. And I hope you, my friends, don't stop either. At the end of the day, as my friend, written here on a little note, says, just keep going, don't stop. Phil Knight, creator of Nike, author of Shoe Dog. Yuns all should read that book. So we're going to hop into what I learned this week. This is the 74th time that I've made this document that you're kind of listening to, or I'm referring to as I create this. Every single week I take the things I've learned, my learnings, and I write them down, and I select 7 of them to extrapolate upon and riff on, and that's what we're doing right now. And you can call this a leadership guide, you can call this an inspiration guide, you can call this a motivation guide, you can call it a learning guide. I was lifting this morning, I was doing buys, right? So I was lifting, I was pumping out some bicep curls on the straight bar, and I thought, wow, this sounds cool. Spaniard School of Learning and Toughness. Spaniard's School of Learning and Toughness. I like the sound of that. But that's what this document is, the learning part, right? And then the training is the toughness part. But then the learning also complements the toughness part because it's all intertwined and related. I'm just going to get to the what I learned this week document. Much of this is coming from the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. Fascinating book. I was talking to someone yesterday and we were talking about this book and the history in this book, and it's not easy to read, and it's really interesting because you hear about the history of the Native Americans in this country and some of the things that were done to them. Many of the things that were done to them. It's taking this people and we're moving in on their territory. And I say we because I am an American citizen. I was born here in the United States, so it is part of our history. It's part of our DNA as a country, and just for that fact, I think it's extremely important that we learn about. And then you tie in this group of people, how they acted, how the U.S. and the Europeans acted, and I think we can all learn a lot from it. Not just from a big meta picture of it in terms of society and governments and interacting with different types of people, but also from like a leadership and communication standpoint, because a lot of the trouble between the Native Americans and the Americans moving westward to the Europeans was communication. The last bullet point I believe I'm going to talk about today is impeccability, right? Be impeccable with your word. That therein lies a ginormous part of the problems that exists that I'm learning about in this book. So let's hop in where AMX 546, where I start the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. There was a quote that says this. In this, perspective. I talked about perspective in this week's AMX Kids. I mentioned it a couple times throughout the week. Dredd mentioned it to me as I was talking to him, a conversation about AMX Kids, and later it crossed over to Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And that's my favorite part about learning, right? That's my favorite part about reading all these books, conducting all these conversations, and then listening to other conversations by way of other podcasts. You start to see themes. And this idea of perspective is one of those themes. Like how can you put yourself in the shoes of somebody else? How can you think, how could this person possibly think this way? And then it's perspective, and then you switch your perspective to their shoes, and then you think, okay, maybe I can imagine how they could feel this way. I still don't agree with it, but maybe I can imagine how they feel this way. Well, the author Dee Brown wrote the book essentially to put us in the perspective of the Native Americans. There's a quote in the introduction that says this: Americans who have always looked westward when reading about this period should read this book facing eastward. Isn't that cool? Americans who have always looked westward when reading about this period should read this book facing eastward. If you're like me, I don't remember much about learning about Native Americans in the West and the frontier, other than I remember Lewis and Clark. I remember those names. But when I was in middle school and high school, I didn't much care about history at all, right? I just wanted to wrestle and hang out with my friends, and I was worried about having a pimple and stuff like that. But what we learned was looking westward, right? It was learned from looking westward, east, the East Coast, 13 colonies, the United States, looking westward, right? The expansion into the West, the Western frontier. But this book is written from the perspective of the Native Americans looking east, right? So you're in your home, you're in your house, you're in your town, you're in your community, and it's like, whoa, I'm looking east, and all these people are coming and taking my stuff. So that's the perspective, and that's why I really am glad that I read this book, or I'm enriched, or I'm better, or I'm more knowledgeable, or I'm more empathetic, having read this book because of that. I think it's a really, really neat point, reading this book looking eastward. Moving on, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So let's think back, and I am certainly not a history buff, as I afforded you in the previous comment. I know a decent amount about it, having read this book and other books, but upon arriving in San Salvador, which is where Columbus landed, he described the Indios, and Indio just means indigenous person, indigenous people. Columbus described the Indios as, now, I included what I'm about to read because I'm an idealist, right? I'm an idealist. Cale Sanderson, I heard him talk one time. It was the first time I ever heard the idea of being satisfied, being unsatisfied. So I am very satisfied as a human being. I like my life. I like myself, whatever. I'm happy as a person. But there's also this fire burning inside of me, this fire raging inside of me for more. So you learn to balance that, right? It's a yin and a yang. It's a dichotomy that exists within myself, but I'm sure within a lot of other people. So I'm including this quote because it is so freaking idealistic and something that I'm aiming for and that I hope you aim for as well. So upon arriving in San Salvador, Columbus described the Indios as, quote, so tractable, so peaceable. They love their neighbors as themselves. There is not in the world a better nation. It is true that they are naked, yet their manners are decorous and praiseworthy. Decorous and praiseworthy. That word I didn't know, decorous, but it comes from the idea of decor, and it means elegant or fine or polite or gracious and praiseworthy. So as I said, I'm an idealist, and when I hear those words, they love their neighbors as themselves, there's not in the world a better nation. How cool would it be for someone to speak of you, to say that, this person, he or she, whoever's listening, loves their neighbors as themselves. There's not in the state, there's not in the country, there's not in the world a better person to live next to. There's not in the world a better teacher to whom I send my kids. How awesome would that be for someone to speak that way of you? I think it would be really freaking awesome. And that's what I'm fighting for. And I hope that's what you're aiming for as well. Moving on to the next bullet point, talking about AMX kids. Now, I have, it's funny. As I mentioned, Dredd, in my conversations we have on a regular basis. I mean, you'd think we won the $1 million jackpot 1,000 times in the past 2 years. But we just keep going and going and going. And one of these times, we're going to hit the $1 million jackpot. We know we will. So I've whiffed, right? I've swung and missed and pulled some muscles all over my body in my attempts at what I think is cool. And what I think is great. And what I think is the next thing. But the bottom line is, it certainly matters what I think is cool and great, etc., to me as a person. But in terms of building this business, if you don't resonate with that, then business-wise, it doesn't much matter. The next thing I think is the next big thing is AMX kids. Look, I am a parent. My kids are 5 and 2. I value reading, I value respect, I value gratitude, I value virtues, I value character, I value values, right? So AMX Kids is my way of providing that map, providing that blueprint for kids. So I'm reading kids' books. And has this taken off like a bat out of heck? Nope. Have people shown sincere interest in it? Yep. Am I going to keep going until Dredd and I objectively decide, maybe this isn't the best thing? Yep. Do I think I'm ever going to stop doing it? Nope. Because I love it. Not only do I love reading these books, because I was looking for books to read. So if you just Google top 100 middle school age books, books are going to come out and nostalgia is going to set in. I mean, I was at the beach a couple weeks ago sweating, not nervous, but anxious because I didn't know which book to choose. I wanted to read all of these books. There were so many great ones because it dawned on me, Dummy Charlie in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, I didn't realize this. These youth books, these kids' books are written to provide life lessons. They're written to teach life lessons. So what I'm doing is I'm extracting and riffing upon those life lessons in the book. I'm offering up, maybe it's a reading, maybe it's an accompanying guide, maybe it's a reading guide, maybe it's a supplemental guide. I don't know what it is, but I know that it's really cool. And what I'm doing is I'm extracting these life lessons. So this week's topics. So I finished off the book, The Breadwinner by Deborah Ellis. Great book, tremendous book, has some heavy content involved in it. So it's certainly a book that I would recommend you reading with your middle schooler. But this week's topics were, 1, thinking about your future, pretty important. 2, getting back up after getting knocked down. Holy cow, that's important. And number 3, our old friend perspective, of which I was just talking about. So I'm doing my best, and I'd love feedback. I know several of you out there are listening because you've commented, you've told me. I would love feedback. If you are listening to it, and my relatives especially, if you're listening to this, I want you to tell me, and I'm going to be texting you here soon to ask you why or why not you're listening. Let me know, because I love this. I think it's extremely valuable. Look, my wife teaches in a middle school. The problems, the challenges, the adversities, the tough situations these kids go through are incredible. They're incredibly difficult. I heard a grown man the other day, as a comedian, someone in the public eye, talking about social media and how getting battered on social media is so tough. And it was an actor, actually, an actor and comedian, the same person. But he was saying how tough it was, and it dawned on me, wow, if this person who's had so much success and knows so much about the world is still getting beaten down by social media, what about a kid who doesn't have that infrastructure, right? Who doesn't have that foundation, still getting beaten down? And that's why I sincerely hope that you use these AMX Kids episodes to start that open line of communication. The most valuable thing that I had with my parents growing up, one of the most valuable, I got to think it through, but it was the open line of communication. There were no secrets. They knew everything. I told them everything. Did it get awkward at times? You bet your butt it did. But that open line of communication was extremely vital and important. And that's why I'm creating these episodes to help foster that open line of communication, right? I'm lobbing up the softball. So please take advantage of it and start that conversation while encouraging lifelong learning. Oh, next week's book, I'm starting Jocko's Way of the Warrior Kid. So that, my friends, I'm telling you right now, it's going to be a grand slam. Moving on to the next bullet point. So some of the pronunciations in this book I do my best with, and I have a couple sources, friends who know more about Native American history and culture than I do, some who are connected to some of the tribes and people in this book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, have helped me out. So there's a Dakota Sioux Indian named Hadenyanka. I believe I'm pronouncing that right, Hadenyanka. But I wanted to include, so this is a quote that he said upon being put to death. And as I've been talking a fair amount of virtues and virtuous living and character development, etc., both for adults and kids, as I was talking about for AMX Kids. But I thought this was a really great quote that, like, when I read something and if it touches my soul, then I record it or I underline it. And I'm obsessive when I do it, right? But what does that mean, touch my soul? If I read a line and it makes me want to be better, if I read a line and it makes me want to help someone, if I read a line and it makes me want to train, if I read a line and it makes me want to hug and kiss my family, if I read a line, that's what I mean when I say touch my soul. It affects me in a positive way. And I read this quote and I thought, wow, like my question to you is, does this not inspire you to stand for something when you hear these words? So upon being put to death, Hadenyanka says this: when my children are grown up, let them know that their father died because he followed the advice of his chief. Let them, his wife and children, remember that the brave should be prepared to meet death, and I will do as becomes a Dakota. A Dakota is one of the branches of the Sioux Indians. When my children are grown up, let them know that their father died because he followed the advice of his chief. Let them remember that the brave should be prepared to meet death, and I will do as becomes a Dakota. It's easy to talk the talk, but it's really inspiring. It's really good for your soul to read this book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and hear real words from real people that, if you're anything like me and you didn't know anything about Native American culture other than what you saw in movies, then reading this book is incredibly enlightening because you realize, wait a minute, the image I have of Native Americans of being like savages who scout people all the time, it's not accurate. And I think this has been a really, trust me, there, and actually, I was going to say, there are bad Indians for certain, just like there's bad groups of people in every situation. But in large part, reading this book has given me perspective, and it's given me the ability to empathize and understand their perspective, looking towards the east, right? Not looking towards the west. So it's a healthy dose of perspective. I think that's one of the biggest things that this book has given me. Speaking of history, moving on to the next bullet point, in AMX 549, I got pretty specific. And I'm not going to get specific again, because you can go to AMX 549, just click on it in your feed, and you can hear some of the specifics. You can read the book and read the specifics on your own. There's another podcast with Daniele Bolelli. He's an Italian guy, but it is called History on Fire. There's two, actually. Hardcore History, I believe, is with a guy named, I think it's Dan Carlin, but History on Fire is with Daniele Bolelli. Episode number 32 goes into depth about the Sand Creek Massacre. In this book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, they go in depth. But the Sand Creek Massacre, Google it, Sand Creek Massacre, is something I believe we should all know about. It's not easy to read about, but it happened, and it's part of our history. It's part of our DNA. And I feel there's something pure about knowledge. There's something pure about awareness, about knowing who you are, where you come from, some good, some bad, but there's something I feel that's important about that. And I think that the Sand Creek Massacre is part of our country's history. It's incredibly difficult to read about. It's incredibly unjust. It's disgusting, but it did happen. And for me, empathy and understanding and perspective, empathy, understanding, and perspective, again, are three things that I took from learning about the Sand Creek Massacre. So I really hope that you heed my suggestion and do some research on the Sand Creek Massacre. The next bullet point, this comes from the interview I did on Thursday from a guy, my friend, named Jeff Campbell. So Mike Sorelli, who works with Jocko and Leif and Dave Burke and the rest of the Echelon Front team, Navy SEAL, he was on my show, or a Marine Recon, then a Navy SEAL, he was on the show, and he introduced me to Matt Bradford, who was a tremendous guest that you listened to last week, and he also introduced me to Jeff Campbell, tremendous guest who was on the show podcast on Thursday, episode number 191. And Dredd texted me, so I didn't know. This is my favorite thing. Me, you know how earlier I was talking about not wanting to be bored, wanting to be excited and a little nervous, etc. I love going into conversations and situations where you don't necessarily know where it's going to go. You know, the guests that I have on my show, of course I know a little bit about them, enough to have an intelligent introduction, and then the conversation just takes off. But I don't do extensive research because I want to learn from, I want to ask curious questions that arise from that set and setting, that boom, that moment. That's how conversations are in real life. You know, that's how it happens. You meet someone and you talk. You don't know their history, etc. So I like going in prepared, but not overly prepared. Well, Jeff Campbell is case in point of that. I knew he used to play in the NFL, but that was about it. If you Google his name, there's not a lot you're going to find out. I knew he was a solid person and a great guest for the show because I confide, I trust in Mike Sorelli, and that's what he told me. So I thought, okay, great. I want to have the guy on the show. So Dredd called me, and Dredd texted me immediately after listening to this episode prior to publishing it and said that was one of the most connectable interviews I've ever heard you do. It was awesome. Jeff and I connected. We had fun. We talked. We laughed. We got into some great content that's going to help you. Failure, hard work, the idea of keeping going. We talk concussions. We talk a lot of really relevant stuff that I know you're going to be interested in content-wise. One of the quotes from the interview is this. This is from Jeff. You're going to understand that failure is the one thing that makes you great. It's embracing the struggle. It's being able to understand that failure is nothing but learning. I'm going to repeat that. Failure is nothing but learning. You have to be able to process each separate episode of that and compartmentalize it and understand what it is. So Jeff was able to play with some of the greatest players in NFL history. He tells some very neat behind-the-scenes stories about Barry Sanders, running back Barry Sanders. It was absolutely incredible. This insight you don't just get, right? You don't just walk upon it. I chanced upon it, and thankfully it was recorded. Thankfully Jeff was gracious enough to have that conversation with me on the air. So again, that's episode number 191. And I want to repeat that. Failure is nothing but learning. That's fun. Failure is nothing but learning. Moving on to the last bullet point, and I alluded to this early on, the idea of impeccability. So if you look up impeccable in the dictionary, it means flawless. I first heard it with the 4 agreements, be impeccable with your word. It's then in the Success Principles by Jack Canfield, speak with impeccability. Bear Grylls speaks about it. And with Bear Grylls, it was if he was talking about gossip and not gossiping. And I remind myself about this on a regular basis. So he defined gossip, Bear Grylls defined gossip as this. If the person you're speaking to will think less of the person you're speaking about, then it's gossip, so cut it out. Isn't that cool? Isn't that simple? Isn't that a test? What a test that is. And I recite that test to myself when I'm about to open my mouth. And I'm not perfect, but I can tell you I'm dang better than I used to be. Just think in that mindset. If the person you're speaking to will think less of the person you're speaking about, then it's gossip. So cut it out. That's a cool bar to set out there. But in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and the wisdom of the Native Americans, and even in Awakening Spirits, learning about Native Americans, learning about their culture. They're very generous. I talked, with the Columbus quote where they were decorous and praiseworthy. They loved their neighbors as themselves. There were several different times in these books that I'm reading where I read the fact that the Indians, it was foreign to them, the idea of lying or the idea of making a promise and not following through with it. And so they got taken advantage of because they were very giving and generous, and they didn't realize that we're being taken advantage of over and over and over again. And it was really interesting that to hear that, to imagine that, right? To imagine that you're so giving and so just that you just keep getting taken advantage of. Like it's sad. It's unfortunate. It's something that's not easy to read or think about. So in the book, a theme, the Indians were given and taken away treaties that didn't stand for anything, and they were changed often. It talks about signing treaties that either one, that the Native Americans didn't understand because they didn't understand the language. They were coerced or forced into signing. They might sign something, to just a simple example. Maybe it said to give away 15% of their land, and actually it was ratified and it said 85% of their land. Now, I just made that up, but that's an example of what it could be like. But in the book, it was described that these treaties, what was said and what was actually written, or what was written and then what was actually made official, were like, and I thought this was really cool, really neat expression, were like 2 horses whose colorations do not match. They were like 2 horses whose colorations did not match. 2 horses whose colorations did not match. And again, another neat figure of speech, and I want to share with you these figures of speech because they're in my vernacular now, and I think they're neat, and they're succinct ways of getting your point across. But another one that I believe that I read in The Wisdom of the Native Americans was speak straight like an arrow, right? Speak straight like an arrow. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the history. I hope you enjoyed the culture, the inspiration, motivation, education that came along with this week's What I Learned. I sincerely encourage you all to visit charliespaniard.com. Opt into my email list where you'll get this document sent to you every week. Also, check out charliespaniard.com/reading list for all the books that I'm reading. You can get those books there to help support the show. You can check out my speaking programs and always connect on social media at Charlie Spaniard. See ya. All right, folkies, I hope you enjoyed, and had fun with this week's edition of What I Learned. I know I certainly did. And I encourage you all to, yeah, you know the rule, you know the routine. I appreciate all the support. If you haven't left Paul Toast, I just got your review on iTunes. Thank you very much. If you have not left a review on iTunes, please consider doing so. It's easy. I'll walk you through it. If you've been listening to the show more than like 50 times, it would really mean a lot to me if you did leave a review. Message me and I will actually walk you through it one-on-one, or I'll send you a video. Either way, I appreciate it, and have yourselves a great weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday morning for AMX 551. See ya.